Finally, at politics. It's one of my favorite subjects, if you can't tell. So we're gonna look first at men and women in the office. So in office, I should say, not the office, in elected office. So most of the history that's taught in school is, of course, the history of American politics, and that's called political history. And it focuses on who was elected to office, the decisions made, wars fought, peace made, and the general things that happen in the world of the political elite. And I'm sure you remember history classes. Hopefully, you're taking some now, um, because they're fascinating to, you know, uh, help you understand how we got to where we are, basically, what went before. So, who are the political elite? They're the small group of people who hold high level positions of power and responsibility in a government. For most of our history, they were, as we talked about already, exclusively male. So, of course, most of the history we learn about is about men. And that's why when high school students in the US are asked to name 10 famous American women, most can only do it by adding the Mrs. to the last names of presidents. I'm surprised a lot of them know 10 presidents' names, but at any rate, uh, so on the average, students could name 11 male names, but only 3 female ones without using the Mrs. strategy. When the definition of activity, i.e., political activity, is extended beyond the political elite, we begin to see the importance of women's contributions to history. Because women have been active in social movements and civic organizations that also have very important political consequences. For example, 40,000 women formed the Women's Peace Party from 1914 to 1915 during the First World War, while at the same time, thousands were involved in the suffrage movement, the women's right to vote movement, the settlement house movement, which addressed immigrants and urban poverty, and the temperance movement in the 19th century. All of those were in the 19th century. The temperance movement was the banning alcohol movement. And the reason they wanted to ban alcohol, by the way, was because of what it was. They saw it destroying families, with men primarily spending all their paychecks on, they get it Friday, they'd go to the bar, and that'd be it. Okay, and also the violence against women, and that type of thing that was supported by a lot of alcoholism at that point. In the 20th century, so that was the 19th century. In the 20th century, women worked to secure reproductive freedom and equal rights. That was the second wave of women's movement, as well as working for peace movements and the expansion of social welfare. Other women became involved in workers and union movements as well, and so they were very, very important in those movements. But since these type of movements usually work outside of the established official politics, the players aren't nearly as well known, right? The names aren't as well known. They're not as well respected. But as of 2022, there were 28 countries where 30 women serve as heads of state and government. These do not include non-elected figurehead monarchs. So the 28 countries where women hold 30 positions of power are elected positions. At the current rate, given that, gender equality in the highest positions of power will not be reached for another 130 years, according to the United Nations. So it's going to take 130 years, if it happens, for there to be gender equality in the heads of governments in all the countries around the world. Only 21% of governmental ministers are women, and only 14 countries have achieved 50% or more women in their cabinets. And they were typically, the stereotypically gender based kinds of positions in the cabinets. Because the five most common positions held by the women were, guess what? Family, children, youth, elderly, and disabled, followed by social affairs, environmental and natural resources, employment, labor, vocational training, and women's affairs and gender equality. At a slightly lower level of government, women hold about 26% of parliamentary seats worldwide, not heads of government, but people in the parliament or legislature. It would be the equivalent of our legislative Senate and House. The three countries that have achieved a 50% or greater percentage of women in political positions of power is Rwanda, of all places, 61.4%, Cuba, 53%, and Bolivia, 53%. Mexico, Sweden, Grenada, and Namibia come in next. And the Nordic and Swedish countries do best of the women in their parliaments, of having women in their actual parliaments. And once again, there's a video on Finland and Finnish heads of state. So that's kind of interesting. The largest recent increases since 2008 of women in positions of political, parliaments or legislatures are in Central America, with an increase of 13%. In the U.S., as of 2022, 27.5% of the seats in Congress are held by women. So that's slightly over 1/4. When we look at women and men, by the way, that's slightly over 1/4, and women are over 50% of the population in the United States. When we look at women and men in political office, we find two very interesting questions, though, about gender and power. So the first one is, how do we explain that in many countries around the world, women's right to vote doesn't translate into equal representation in the government, including in the U.S., especially in the U.S., as I just said? So what barriers do women face when they run for office, and/or why don't they do so? The second question is then, so why are their numbers so low? What barriers do they face when they run for office? But the second question is, would it matter? Would it matter to have more women in positions of political power? Well, we're going to look at that now. And one of the ways to check that out is, again, to look at the policies of Scandinavian countries that have, such wonderful, paternity and maternity leave, and, just the best education systems in the world. What else do they have? Lots of vacation time for people, that type of thing. So political scientists call this substantive representation. It's substantive. It matters, okay? Or does it matter? But that's what substantive representation would mean. Does it matter or not? And it's the extent to which the members of a particular group represents the interests of that group once they're elected. So descriptive or numerical representation, those statistics I gave you, on the other hand, it's just the numbers of a particular group who hold office. It doesn't automatically mean that they're have any power, that they're serving the needs and interests of the group from which they are elected. So we're going to start looking at the first question. Why are women still underrepresented in positions of power? This is the numerical representation. And the phrase that I'm going to tell you now is from the musical Hamilton, when Aaron Burr sings about wanting to be, quote, in a room where it happens. So in that musical, it refers to the compromise between Hamilton and Jefferson, in 1790 in the United States. And it's a metaphor. The room where it happens is a metaphor for the closed door world of politics, where often the real important decisions are actually get made in those closed door rooms. And if you're not in the room, if you're on the outside, then you're not in the power circle where it's happening. The room is always much more than just about electability. It's about or about being able to do the job well, because the room's occupants are invariably, usually heterosexual white males, making politics like a social club of those who belong to that particular elite group. So a US woman legislator said that, quote, women are on the outside when the door to the smoke-filled room is closed. And of course, there's a whole series of gatekeepers who patrol access to politics. And when we examine how gender affects who gets past the gates, that's part of answering this question of why the smoke-filled room is closed to primarily women, but other men as well who are not as powerful or as in the in group. So we're going to look at now who makes a good leader. Let's look at race, gender, and electability. So if you look at the figure 11.4 on page 415 in your text, it shows how gender impacts the perceptions and qualities necessary for leadership and therefore for electability for women. So what happens then when race or when gender is combined with race and Black women in particular? Well, of course, as we know, many people, if not most people, vote along party lines. But if you take the political parties out of the equation, what other factors influence voting decisions? Well, social definitions like race, gender, and sexual identity, as you might imagine, are very important. For example, in the 2020 presidential election, some polling research found that although many voters felt allied with Senator Elizabeth Warren, they didn't vote for her in the primaries because they were worried about her, quote, electability. Of course, she did eventually get elected when we got past the primaries in the general election. So the concept of electability is, not surprisingly, of course, tied to stereotypes and prejudices. Now, Elizabeth Warren is a highly educated white woman. Okay, so there's a lot of stereotypes and prejudices that aren't there with her, but she's still a woman, so you've got those. Okay. Now, in the US, a study found that voters place high value for candidates on warmth and competence, placing slightly more value on competence. And Black candidates are generally perceived as less educated, less accomplished, less powerful, less well-spoken, less leader-like, but also more opinionated, more passionate, more vocal, and less manipulative. The double whammy being a Black woman candidate. And I hope you noted all those stereotypes in how voters think about Black candidates: less educated, less well-spoken, all of that. So that's called the double jeopardy hypothesis. Being a Black woman candidate, you got the double jeopardy as being a woman and being Black, okay? Because Black women face compounding discrimination by belonging to multiple marginalized groups. So, does gender equality improve under democracies? The assumption has always been that the answer is yes, but it's not necessarily true at all. Because, for instance, during the introduction of colonialism, under colonialism, there was an introduction in other countries where there was colonialism was happening. There was an introduction of Western values in the global South. And, it just didn't happen. And neither did, there was no real advent of democracy during colonialism either. And actually, in many sub-Saharan African countries, women had traditionally exercised political power and economic power, and then and some very high positions in certain tribes, and then they lost those positions under colonialism, because in many ways the exposure to European gender ideology through colonization increased gender inequality in parts of Africa and other countries where women already had some power. And when democratization began for these countries, it was assumed, of course, that democracy should encourage political parties to give more weight to women's issues. And, there was an assumption that it's a value of democracy, caring about women's issues as opposed to authoritarian systems that don't, et cetera. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of many authoritarian countries, there was an opportunity to test those assumptions. And it turned out, research showed that women's representation in governing bodies actually decreased in the transition to democracy. So in light of that research, which is very shocking, really, and just the opposite of what we would think would happen. So in light of that research, some social scientists began to change their theories about the relationship, revise them about democracy and gender equality in politics, because here's the reason that didn't happen. Democratization, having a democratic system, does not necessarily change the underlying structures of society. So specifically, the introduction of democracy in a country that was not democratic does not change the social and economic inequalities that already exist between women and men. And it also doesn't change or remove the gender ideologies related to women holding political power. And there's the three factors here: social inequality, economic inequality, and cultural ideologies are all very important factors. If you look at social and economic inequality, they are two very important barriers, but the gender ideologies are really critical as well. So in countries where women's primary roles are as mothers and wives, well, then, of course, women are likely to see themselves less as potential politicians, and voters, of course, are much less likely to vote for them. In a US study, for example, women were also significantly less confident about their chances of winning than men, and more likely to think of themselves as unqualified and incapable. Those are internalized ideas, and they're partly the result of what's called political socialization. And that's the process in which people learn what is expected of them in their particular political system. And now we have several organizations that recruit and train women in how to run for office. The one in Oregon is called Emerge. And actually, I went through that process years ago, and it's very supportive. And there's a lot of hands-on help to get you through the process, to learn how, women are very not likely. Let me put it this way: it's very hard for them to call up somebody and say, will you donate to my campaign? Men don't seem, there's been a lot of research on this too, men don't seem to have any problem in asking for money to support their campaigns, but women do. So that's one of the things, excuse me, that they teach you how to do at Emerge, as well as navigate many other systems. So that's a good thing to know, that those organizations are there helping women and training them how to run for office now. And, this isn't surprising. The idea about asking for money is an example as a barrier for women running, because men's and women's political socialization is very, very different. Women are usually socialized to be more passive than men and to direct their concerns to things other than political issues. women aren't socialized into what's called political efficacy, or the sense that what a person does really matters. Can we get back to voting again? That's the simplest form of political efficacy, is do it, do something, because the personal is political, okay? Or that they can make a real difference in politics. That's another thing women are not socialized into thinking about. And so that prevents many women from running for office, and those who do face really, very real cultural beliefs during their campaigns that women shouldn't be political leaders, or also in the form of violence, intimidation, ostracism, and verbal abuse. And I put up a clip for you on the Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump uh, debate where he stalked her on stage. And that's interesting to see. It's only a minute long or something, but the body language you can see in this discussion of this whole chapter about power and coercion, politics, and that type of thing. In addition, with women, as I'm sure you know, there's always a focus on their clothes, their hair, how they look. Sometimes it's subtle. Usually, or most often, it's not particularly subtle. So that's how numerical, why women don't run for office. There are, issues which affects their numbers, of course, in office. Now, what about substantive representation? What happens when they do get elected, when they're actually in office? That's what this section addresses. So, and it's a great title, Strangers in the Halls of Power. So, for example, I don't know, this is probably ancient history to you, but when Clarence Thomas had his hearings to be appointed to the Supreme Court, of course, the sexual abuse allegations of Anita Hill came up, and nobody was going to look into that in the old boys club, okay? And so the questioning of Clarence Thomas at his Supreme Court confirmation hearings about the accusations of sexual harassment occurred only after Senator Barbara Boxer, as she described it, quote, pounded on a closed door to have to beg to be heard on a crucial issue that couldn't really wait for niceties, end quote. More recently, there are repeated examples of women elected officials being excluded from political conversations that would make sense for them to be involved in as women. For example, I love this one. Well, I don't really love it, but it's ironic as heck. When a hearing was held by the House of Representatives on H.R. 7, H.R. 7 is the, quote, No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act. It consisted of 12 men and no women. So here's an act they're having a debate on, they're hearing on, that is going to refuse any taxpayer money for abortions, and there's no women. Out of the 12, there's 12 men and no women at the hearing. And then here's another one. The House Oversight and Government Reform Committee on Birth Control Subcommittee. Wait, I'm sorry. And the House, this is a really long title. That House Oversight and Government Reform Committee on Birth Control and Subcommittee on Birth Control Access. The 5-person panel didn't include any women. So this is in our Congress. The issues of numerical representation and substantive representation are of course, closely related, because interviews with women legislators suggest that they feel some responsibility to represent the interests of women, even in the face of resistance. And because women in elected and appointed offices in the United States have distinctive policy priorities compared with their male colleagues, they feel, very strongly that they should be involved in some of these decisions that exclusively involve women pretty much and their bodies, as at a minimum, those. They're far more focused on men issues related to women, children, and families. And, those aren't the only issues that they're concerned with, but they are the issues that they have the most success with in general because they're considered appropriate for women to be involved with, women, children, and families. Um, and women legislators tend to view public policy problems more broadly. They're more holistically, I would say, and which leads them to find solutions in a different way. For example, male politicians are more likely to view criminal behavior as just a simple act of breaking the law and everybody needs to be punished for it, while women are more likely to look for the societal factors that might lead to criminal behavior. In 2018, Nevada became the first state to have a majority of female legislators, and the effects have been both big and small. In small ways, they've been empowered to speak out, and the culture of the legislature itself has changed because for years, charges of sexual harassment were shrugged off or belittled at the state house in Nevada, and bills sponsored by women were sometimes mocked. For example, in 2015, legislators refused to, this is in Nevada, before women became the majority in the legislature. In 2015, legislators refused to schedule a hearing on a bill to promote equal pay for women. A woman legislator said, quote, the boys club said, quote, why do we need that? It was a very misogynistic session. Misogynism is formally translated from the Latin as hatred of women. Gynistic is GYN is always root for women in Greek and Latin, and mis is against, the MIS, the prefix. So still, in 2017, even the sexism lingered even with a female majority. So by 2017, there was a female majority in the Nevada House of Legislature. And even with female majority in 2017, women legislators received anonymous phone calls from men commenting on their lips and threatening sexual violence. Another female legislator was constantly asked by her male colleague, have you been a good girl today? So having a female majority legislature impacts not just the culture of the body, but also which bills get passed. Since Nevada began its session, bills prioritizing women's health and safety have risen to the top of the agenda. More than 17 bills were considered that dealt with sexual assault, sex trafficking, and sexual misconduct, and women's access to abortion by passing the Trust Nevada's Women Act. Isn't that a great name? Trust Nevada's Women. That's the name of the act that they passed, which is a law that removes restrictions on the ability to get an abortion. So what about gender and leadership styles? As I'm sure you know, they're very different. You can just, watch any news program where they're interviewing, or debates, a variety of other things, and see the difference in gendered leadership styles. And not only that, there's a million debates, not a million, there's many debates on how you define leadership, even what it is, let alone the style. So Carol Gilligan, who's a very famous author, used psychoanalytic theory to argue that women as leaders tend to emphasize cooperation over conflict, inclusion over exclusion, and consensus over hierarchy. She argued that those differences are huge differences. They're opposites, right? Cooperation over conflict, inclusion over exclusion, and consensus over hierarchy, getting everybody to agree over somebody telling you, what's going to happen. She argued that those differences are due to the early caregiver roles and dynamics of women. and that men tend to be more concerned about people interfering with each other's rights in moral dilemmas. And that's commonly called the ethics of culture. The idea that, uh, the concern about people interfering with each other's rights in moral dilemmas. That's called the ethics of justice. Women, on the other hand, are more worried about helping others, and that approach is called the ethics of care. Now, as you might imagine, there's an awful lot of research in political science on either proving or disproving that theory, because here's the theoretical idea of it. Women's ethic of care leads them to form a more contextual view of the world. That you put things in context with their surroundings, with their history, with a complex web of interrelationships and interdependence. And in that worldview, that ethics of care worldview, it only makes sense that then your solutions are going to be broader, are going to have a bottom, right? If you're taking more into consideration, then when you're writing the laws, it's going to be a broader perspective that addresses more aspects of the problem. Now, some research does confirm that theory of feminine leadership style. Women, for example, women chairs of legislative committees place more emphasis on completing tasks in a team-oriented way rather than simply directing others as their male colleagues do about what to do. Another study found that women use a consensus style of leadership where, all right, we're going to talk all this out till we can all agree on something. That's consensus, rather than the command and control style of their male counterparts. So with more women elected over time, it actually could transform the operations of institutional power in very significant ways. But on the other hand, that very leadership style that could actually transform politics also excludes them from certain aspects and areas of decision making. So we learned at the beginning that power is a very tricky thing. Those who have power don't always realize that they do. Those who don't have it sometimes get tricked into supporting the very ideas and false systems that oppress them. And there we are back to false consciousness again. It is such a sad, sad thing to see people fighting for the very thing that oppresses them. And, being angry and hostile at the very people that are trying to create solutions to the problems that oppress them, like poverty, like a lousy educational system, like the expense of a good educational system, housing costs, access to medical care, all of those things. So that's false consciousness. When you align yourself with someone who really doesn't have your best interests at heart, but they're giving you a good speech that somehow tricks you and makes you think that they are. So that, let's say it the way the book says it again. Those who don't have power sometimes get tricked into supporting the very systems and ideas that oppress them, and that's false consciousness. And then there's an interesting look here at social class, which I just kind of referred to in that last little section. And now a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu looked at social class as well as power. And his concept of what he called symbolic violence can be applied to so many types of inequality. Symbolic violence describes the way that the relations of domination take on a kind of, naturalness that prevents anyone from questioning their existence. It tells us, this is so sad if you really deeply think about this. So this idea of symbolic violence, You've maybe never thought about these things that we're going to talk about as violence, but it's symbolic violence. So symbolic violence tells us that it's normal and okay to have only 26% of women in the US Congress. It provides many reasons that sound convincing for why a woman has not held the highest office in the United States yet, that over 200 years of history, that of president. Even more importantly, symbolic violence makes us believe that there's nothing we can do about it. And that's what makes it a kind of violence. Okay. Believing in the quote naturalness of inequalities destroys our sense that things could be different or that we can create change by organizing. It tells us that there's no point in even making the effort to organize. And although it's more subtle than physical violence, symbolic violence is possibly even more important. Remember what it just taught us? There's no point, right? You can't fight it, it's too big. And yet we could look at history and look at all the movements, the social movements that changed so much. The anti-war movement, the women's movement with all those laws that got changed. The anti-war movement ended the war in Vietnam, in the 60s. There are so many. We go back to the 19th century and the movement for women to vote. When people organize and also vote, they change the world. They change the laws. But symbolic violence keeps us in this place of, it doesn't, it tells us there's no point in even making the effort to organize. Okay. And that's why the symbolic violence is even more powerful than physical violence, which we could just see plain and simple that it's violent. And here's the whole wrapping up of how powerful symbolic violence is. Because if we didn't believe that things are just the way they are and there's nothing we can do about it, what could we accomplish? Well, I just gave you kind of a litany of what could be accomplished, what has been accomplished. But if you do not have the energy or the time, or you don't feel you're capable of being involved in a social movement, the one thing you can do that takes virtually no time and energy is to vote. And that's it's the major blessing of a democratic system, is that you do have a choice. There is something you can do that doesn't involve getting out in the street and putting your life on the line and, marching and all of that, which is how things have changed and will change again. But this is a very simple, quiet, especially in Oregon where we have mail-in voting. If you're in Oregon, I presume you are, most of you. So that's the last thing I could say to you. Because if we didn't believe that things are, quote, just the way they are, and that there's, quote, nothing we can do about it, what could we accomplish? Remember, the personal is political. Okay? If you want to see, people just don't understand the power of policy. Student loan forgiveness is an example. How would your life be different? What about access to medical care? That's all involved in every vote you make or don't make. Those things are involved. So I hope that this term, this subject, and particularly this last chapter, help put some things in perspective for you.